Hey viewers, welcome to part 2 of handling workbook file contention. If you haven't seen part 1, please do so as I show how a standard approach of opening workbooks may have issues in certain scenarios. So continuing on from that, in today's video I share how I handle file contention to deal with those situations. I apologize if the video is a bit long, but there is a bit of code to cover, including running some tests. I'll be trying to get through it as fast as possible. To make things easier, I will be sharing the workbook. I'll post the link in the description below, so please be on the lookout for that. Before we get into the code, just a few changes that I made to the workbook from part 1. I moved the scenario results down here for reference and created a new set for today's video to test my code. In part 1, whenever I needed to change between read and write mode, I had to modify the code. Instead, now I have a drop down and the code picks up the value from here. I also had an open without prompt, but the file contention handling is the same whether I open with a prompt or without, so I decided to show the open file dialog instead. As a recap, the standard approach from part 1 opens the workbook, does something, so either reads from it or writes to it, then closes with or without saving the workbook. My approach has a few extra steps. So open the workbook and during the process, flag if there are any scenarios of contention. Then we check for and handle any contention. So either continue, where we do something similar to the standard approach, or don't continue and abort the process. And finally, close with or without saving. If you recall from part 1, when the macro runs, the workbook that we're going to open is either not in use by this user, so the user running the macro, in use by another user, but it's not a shared workbook, or it is a shared workbook. And in each case, the macro is either going to read or write to it. Let's have a look at the code. So defined a subroutine called open source, followed by some variables, and then part of the error handler. So on error, go to open source error. Now this is an integral part of how I deal with file contention. I do have other videos on handling errors in VBA, so please check them out. I'm not going to go into detail here. Next, I like to disable certain settings at the beginning of the macro and re-enable them at the very end. This is optional. I do have another video on certain settings to disable in your macro. Please check it out if you're interested. It can help performance and also make your macro run a little smoothly and uninterrupted. I'll give you a quick look at the subroutine, but I won't go into detail. So essentially, disable the settings and at the very end, re-enable them. Next, store the path separator in a variable, but you could just use the backslash throughout your code, that's fine. Then determine if we're going to be reading or writing to the workbook. In part 1, I was hard coding true and false and I had to keep switching between them. This time I decided to just use the drop down that I mentioned earlier. Save workbook. If we're reading, it won't save. If we're writing, it will try and save. Just a quick note, WS main is a code name or an alias that I've given to sheet 1. If you're not familiar with that concept, please check out my how to reference worksheets video as I talk about this in detail and the advantages of using this over the standard worksheets or even sheets, and then the sheet name. Since we're using the file dialog to select the source file, we can give it a startup path to look in. Then the user can navigate away if they need to. So I'm using the macros path, then a backslash, then subfolder called inputs. It's just a constant with the value inputs, and then the backslash at the end. If you don't put this, it will open up in the macros path and look for files starting with the word inputs. If you want the macro to open a specific file and not give the user the option, just append the name to the end. But I want to use the dialog, so I'm just going to keep the folder. Now we can call the open workbook function that I created, and this will work with both file dialog and specific files. Now there are a number of parameters, and I'll go through each one. The first one, WB, is defined as a workbook. It is a reference to the workbook that is returned by the open workbook function. We can use it to read from or write to that workbook and even close it and so on. Full file name is what we defined up here, either the startup path for file dialog or a specific file. This one is whether the macro is going to be reading or writing, as we defined up here. The next three are returned by the open workbook function, and they correspond to these scenarios: in use this user, in use other user, or shared. So when the macro tries to open the workbook, if it's already opened by this user, the user running the macro, then it will return true for already open. If the workbook is in use by another user and it's not shared, it will return true for in use. If the workbook is shared, it will return true for is shared. Then further down, we can interrogate these variables to determine how to proceed. And I'll show you that a bit later on. Next, MSG or messages. This is going to be returned by the function. It will include runtime errors and any file contention errors relating to one of these variables. We can then use this message to display to the user, or even override that message and display our own message further down. Next parameter indicates whether we want to use the file dialog or not. In this case, true, we will be. After that is the caption that we want to appear in the file dialog. Finally, we've got a boolean called cancelled. If the user cancelled the file dialog and doesn't select the file, it will return true. If you don't want to use the file dialog, simply do that. We don't need those parameters. They have default values if they're not specified. And of course, you would need to specify a specific file name up the top here. So with the function highlighted or the cursor inside the function name, hold Shift, press F2, and it takes you directly to the function. Now I'm not going to go over all the parameters again. Suffice to say, the file dialog ones are optional and they have default values assigned. Next, we have some variables defined, followed by the error handler for this function. Here, I'm resetting some return parameters. Now, the reason for this is you might call the open workbook function multiple times for different source files. You don't want to reuse a value that was set on a previous call. If show prompt equals true, we're going to use the file dialog. Now, the first thing I do is if the last character in full file name is not an asterisk, then I set the wildcard character to this variable called wildcard, and then I'm going to append it to the file name further down. First, configure what we want the file dialog to look like and then show it. So first create it, set fd open equal to application.fileDialog. So we're going to use MSO file dialog file picker. Then we're going to do with fd open. Now, if you're not familiar with a with statement, instead of repeating this, you can just do with fd open, then dot each method or property. So the first thing we do is dot initial file name. So this is a startup path, the full file name, ampersand wildcard. Dot allow multi-select equals false. We only want one file. This is the filters, the file types that you'll see in the open file dialog. So first clear whatever we set it to, then add any Excel file extensions that you want, and we make that as the first item in the list, and then all files, star.star is the second item. Dot title equals the open caption that we pass through. Initial view, I like to use details, but you could change it to whatever you want. So if I delete that, hold Control, press space, and it will give you a whole list that you can use. Once it's configured, we do a .show that will display it. If selected items is greater than 0, that means a file has been selected. Then we assign the first one, since we're only doing single select, we're not doing multi-select, we assign it to selected file. If selected file is empty, VB null string, that means the user has cancelled the dialog and not selected a file. Set cancelled equal to true. Define a message that we want to show the user. Return true to the function. All right, it hasn't failed, the user has just cancelled it. And then we go to the exit label. It will just return the message and go back to the caller. So I'll just go to the end and just show you quickly what it does. So it jumps straight down to this label, sets that parameter that's in the function definition equal to the message that we defined, and it exits the function. All right, so let me show you just that part working. All right, so I'm going to cancel it, but we'll just click open with prompt. Here's our file dialog. Zoom in a bit more. Our captions, select source, and down the bottom on the right, we have our filters, Excel files, or I can change it to all files. The user could select the file or navigate to another folder and so on. I'm just going to cancel. Right. And I get our message, file not selected, process aborted. And click OK. So that's just to show you the file dialog. If the user selects a file instead of cancelling, then store the selected file in full file name. And the reason we do that is that from here down, all the code is the same whether you use the file dialog or not, and it uses full file name in the code. The next thing we do is get the file name only from that whole path file name. The reason we do that is the first thing we want to do is check if that selected file or the specific file is already opened by the user running the macro. And to do that, we do this command, set workbook WB equal to workbooks and the file name only. Let's take a look at the get file name function. There's one parameter, full file name, so path and file name, returns a string which will just contain the file name. So define a variable called FSO and declare it as an object, and then set FSO equal to create object scripting.filesystemObject. Then FSO.getFileName from the full file name, it will return just the file name and assign it to the return value of the function. Now, if it doesn't find it, it's not open, it's going to return an error. So on error resume next will allow it to continue. Otherwise, it would trigger an error. If the workbook is open, then WB will have a reference to it. If it's not, it'll be nothing, it'll be empty. So first I'll reset the error handler just in case there was an error. So on error, go to 0, that clears the error, and then reset it back. The way I designed this function is that it checks the various scenarios and sets any relevant flags and associated messages. But it doesn't take any action, it just sends it back to the calling subroutine and allows it to decide how to continue from there. And the reason I did that is for flexibility. For example, let's say our macro is going to import 3 different workbooks with different requirements. Now with the first workbook, the requirement might be if it's in use by this user that's running the macro, but it's only importing data, then just continue with the macro. With the second workbook, the requirement for the same scenario might be to ask the user via a prompt. And with the third workbook, it may simply be abort the process. So this gives us a fair bit of flexibility how to handle each workbook in each scenario. So the first thing is to check if the workbook is already open by the user running the macro. We do that by if WB is nothing equal to false, or alternatively, if not WB is nothing. Then check if the macro is reading. So if for read equals true, set this message. If it's writing, set this message. Then we set already open flag equal to true and the return value of the function equal to true, and go to the open workbook exit, not error. This is not an error, it is a possible issue that we return back to the calling subroutine. It can handle it the way it wants to. Before we test, let's head back to the calling subroutine. So it calls open workbook. It will receive a reference to the already open workbook. Already open will be true, and the function will return true. So the code will drop down to this. Since I will be selecting a file, cancelled will be false. And so we drop down into this section. And here is where we put all our checks for the different scenarios, depending on the requirements. So for my already open by the person running the macro, if it's already open and the macro is reading, then just continue. So it's going to skip this. However, if it's open and writing, then we're going to set this message, which is the message that was returned by the open workbook function. And then it's going to append the do you wish to proceed anyway. Okay, and then we display that message. If the user selects no, then we abort. So set the message to process aborted. Now it's important that we clear the WB variable. So set WB equal to nothing. This is so when it drops down to the exit, it doesn't close the workbook. Because I already had it open, I don't want it to close the workbook on me. I might lose some changes. Let's go down to open source exit so I can show you what I mean. Here's the label. Now this is where the workbook gets closed. But I do have a check. So this check here is if the workbook variable has a reference and it's not already open, then only then close the workbook. And because I set WB to nothing earlier on and already open equals true, it's going to skip this part. So it's not going to close the workbook if the user running the macro already has it open. If you choose to, you can override the message that was returned from open workbook. Just do something like this. And then the message box will display it. All right, so we're going to do a test. Now for completeness, I'm going to test the not in use scenario first. So I have read only and I don't have the source file open. So select the source and the data has been imported. We'll just clear it. Now I'm going to make it right. So read only is false. So we're testing this scenario here. So this one here is, let's say, handled. Right. So open, select the source again, and it's finished. So this one is handled. And I'll set this back to read only. Now we're going to be testing the in use by this user. To do that, I will open the source. I've got the source open and now I'm going to read from it. And don't forget, in that scenario, it will just continue and import the data. Here we go, select the source and it's imported the data and finished. Okay, we don't have any file contention message because that's the way I've decided to code the requirements for it. Now, for the write scenario, it's the opposite. We're going to display a prompt. So this one is handled. Open the workbook. And here's our prompt. All right. You currently have source workbook open and it may be overwritten by this macro. Do you wish to proceed anyway? Right, I'm going to say yes. All right, and it's finished. So it would have updated cell D6. Handled. I'll just set this back to read. And you'll see that the source file is still open and the value in D6 has been updated from $5.50 to $6. And that's because in our last test, which was the write to the already open workbook, we decided to continue with the operation. As I mentioned, depending on your requirements, you can do whatever checks you need to here. If you don't need to check the already open and you want to allow read and write, you can just delete that altogether. So we've handled the already open by this user scenarios for both read and write. Let's take a look at the rest of the open workbook function. So if it wasn't opened by this user, let's try and open it. So set WB equals Workbooks.Open file name equals to full file name. Now, if WB is nothing equals true, then we have a runtime error. Okay, so perhaps the user doesn't have access to the file they selected. It may be corrupt, or if we're opening a specific file rather than using file dialog, then perhaps it's no longer there. And in this case, we have to raise an error. So we go to Open Workbook Error. The calling subroutine will have no choice but to abort the process. Take a quick look at the Open Workbook Error. Here's our label. We're just checking if the message hasn't been assigned, then assign this message. Then Open Workbook function will return false. That way the calling subroutine will know to abort the process. Then go to Workbook Exit, which is up here, and just assign that message to the return message parameter, and that way it can be used by the calling subroutine. So if the workbook is not already opened by this user and there is no runtime error, it's opened the workbook. Let's check if the workbook is already in use by another user and that it's not shared. So else if wb.readOnly equals true, then we check if the macro is reading. If it is, then we're going to set this message here. The file name is in use by another user or read-only and may be in an incomplete state. Set in use equal to true. Open workbook return result equal to true, and we go to the open workbook exit. As I mentioned before, this is not an error, it is a potential issue, and let the calling subroutine decide what to do with it. If the workbook is in use by another user and it's not shared, and the macro is trying to write to it, well, obviously it can't. So in this case, we're going to set this message here and process aborted. In use equal to true. However, we're going to go to open workbook error. This will return open workbook equal to false. And then the calling module will know that it needs to abort the process because you can't update it. It's just impossible. One thing I should point out, when the macro tries to open a workbook that's already in use by another user, it will still open an instance of it, albeit as read-only. Okay, back to the calling subroutine. As we did with already open, we can add some checks for in use. Now, if it's in use and the macro wants to write to it, we said the open workbook is going to return false. So if open workbook equals false, go to the open source error. So that's all the way at the end here. Open source error label just checks if the message has been assigned. If not, we assign one. Then go to open source exit, and that is up here. So this is essentially going to close the workbook but not save it in this scenario, re-enable settings that we disabled earlier, and then display the message. Now I've decided that if it's in use, true, and reading, I still want to abort the process just like it would with the write. However, your requirements might be different. you could either display a prompt to the user or just let it proceed anyway, in which case you could just delete that altogether. All right, so we're going to just demonstrate that scenario. In order to do that, I need to open the source as administrator, as I don't have another account. So here's our source opened as administrator, and I'm going to be running the scenario using my account. So this one here, this scenario, so read only, and as I decided that my requirements are, even if we're only reading, if it's in use, we're going to abort the process. Open, select the source. Okay, and here's our message. Source is in use by another user or read only and may be in an incomplete state. Process aborted. Okay. So we've handled this one. Again, you can change that depending on your requirements. Let's make it right. Open, same file, slightly different message. Cannot open source for edit because it's in use by another user or read only. Process aborted. There we go. So this one is handled as well. Now, even though the macro closes the workbook in this case, it's only closing the read-only instance, so it's not affecting the other user. And in fact, here's our source file that's open as administrator, and it's still open. So if the workbook is not already opened by this user, there's no runtime error, and it's not in use by another user, the next thing to do is check if it's a shared workbook. If wb.multiuser editing equals true, then it's a shared workbook. The first thing I want to do in that case is get the number of users that are currently in the workbook. So users equals wb.userStatus. This will return an array of users. To get the number of users, we do shared users equals ubound or upper bound of the users array. Now Shift F2 will show me the definition of that variable. It's defined as a variant, and shared users is an integer. If the macro is reading, I've decided I want to display two different messages depending on how many users there are in the workbook, excluding the macro. So if there are other users, I'm going to display this message here. If it's just the macro, I'll display this message. If you want to show the number of users in the message, don't forget to deduct 1. Now, if we're writing, not reading, so else, going to do a similar thing. If shared users is greater than 1, display this message. Okay. Otherwise, if it's just the macro, we display this message. And as I mentioned in part 1 of this video, when you're writing to a shared workbook with a macro, there is potential to cause multiple conflicts, which then other users have to resolve. There's also possibility of impacting performance and causing the workbook to lock up for others. So updating a shared workbook via macro, I would say try and avoid. But again, this open workbook is not going to take any action in that case. It's only going to notify the calling subroutine of it. Whether the macro is reading or writing to a shared workbook, you set is shared equal to true, open workbook equal to true, and go to open workbook exit. Let's go back to the calling subroutine. After I've checked if the workbook is in use, I'm going to check if it is shared. If it is, and the macro is reading, I'm going to give the user the option on whether to proceed or not based on my requirements. Here I'm using the message that is returned by the open workbook function. As I mentioned earlier, you can override this by putting in your own message. If the macro is writing, I will abort the process based on my requirements. Now, you can change your validation rules to suit whatever requirements you have. So that's my code for dealing with shared workbooks. Let's see how it fares in the scenario test. So I created a shared workbook. I'm going to run the two read and write scenarios. Firstly, with no other active users in the workbook apart from the macro, and then I'll repeat it with another user in the workbook. So here's the shared workbook, just to show that it is in fact shared up the top here. But I will close it because the first run will be without any active users in it. Okay, first run, read, shared workbook with no other active users in it. Select the shared workbook and I get this message. Shared XLSX is a shared workbook with no other active users. That's correct. But this may change while the macro is running. Reading from it is not recommended as it may be in an incomplete state. Do you wish to proceed anyway? I'll say yes. Okay. So it's finished and it has imported the data. Let me clear that. Now we're going to change to write. And if you recall, if I'm writing to a shared workbook, I've decided to abort the process. Shared. Here we go. Shared XLSX is a shared workbook with no other active users, but this may change while the macro is running. Updating is not recommended as it may cause multiple conflicts or performance issues for other users that join while syncing. Process aborted. Okay, so that seems to have worked as I wanted. So next I'm going to test with an active user in the workbook. So again, read only. I have the workbook open as the administrator, so the other user. Okay. This time it should tell us that there is another user in there. Open the prompt. Here we go. Here's our message. Zoom in. Shared XLSX is a shared workbook with one other active users and may be in an incomplete state. Do you wish to proceed anyway? I'll say yes because I'm just importing. Okay, and that has imported successfully. Clear that. Okay, and again with write, it should abort the process. Good. Shared XLSX is a shared workbook with one other active users. Updating it via macro is not recommended as it may cause multiple conflicts or performance issues for other users while syncing. Process aborted. Well, good. So there we have it. I would say these are handled as well. That's all the scenarios I wanted to cover. I try to make this as flexible as possible so that for every workbook that your macro has to open, you can decide which scenarios of contention to handle, if any. You can also take the open workbook function and use it in other macros. I appreciate it was a long video, but I hope you found it useful. If you did, please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on future videos. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video.